In a land ruled by debt, pride, and powerful men, Abigail was told she had no choice. Her father signed away her future, Harrison Vance tried to control her fate, and society expected her to bow her head. But one truth burned brighter than the Texas sun: a human soul cannot be bought. This is not just a Western love story. It is a story about dignity, justice, and the courage to stand as a free person.
The air in Caldwell was thick that morning. It was April, 1878. The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon yet. Just a pale, bruised purple over the Texas scrub. Chink, chink, swish. The rhythm of the milk hitting the pail was the only music I had. My hands were rhythmic. They were strong. I'd been doing this since I was small enough to sit on the stool without my feet touching the dirt. I looked at my hands. They were stained with toil. In this life, work is supposed to be a woman's quietest virtue. But I knew better. I looked at the cows. I'd named the big one Bessie. My father hated that. He said naming things made you soft when it was time to sell them. I stopped milking for a second. The silence felt heavy, too quiet. Even the sparrows had stopped their chattering near the trough. A person's worth isn't found in what they can do for a man, I whispered to the barn walls. I said it out loud because if I didn't, the wind might blow the thought right out of my head. It's found in the fact that I exist. I am a human being with a mind of my own, and no amount of chores changes that. I stood up. My back popped. That's when I heard the voices. They were behind the barn door. Low. Urgent. One was my father, Thomas. He sounded like a man drowning in shallow water. The other was Harrison Vance. You didn't need to see Harrison to know he was there. You could feel the greed radiating off him like heat off a tin roof. "I don't have the 800, Harrison," my father said. His voice was thin. "The cattle died. The winter was cruel." "I don't want your dust, Thomas," Harrison replied. He sounded bored. "I've got plenty of land. What I need is someone to keep my son from turning into a total savage. I need a wife for Arthur." My heart didn't just drop. It turned to lead. I didn't wait. I didn't hide. I stepped around the corner of the barn, the milk pail still heavy in my hand. I looked Harrison Vance right in his cold, gray eyes. "I am not a head of cattle, Mr. Vance," I said. My voice didn't shake. I made sure of that. "You and my father are talking about a trade, but you're forgetting the most important part of the equation. Me." Harrison smirked. It was a nasty look. "Your father signed the deed, girl." I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "A deed to a house can be signed away," I told them. I kept my words simple, direct. "But a human soul cannot be bartered. You might own the dirt I'm standing on by sunset, but you do not own the woman standing on it. I have the right to my own life. That is a truth that belongs to me, not to a contract." Harrison chuckled. "You've got a sharp tongue, Abigail. Arthur will hate that, or maybe he'll like it. Doesn't matter. The debt is due." He tipped his hat and walked toward his horse. I stood there watching the dust settle. My father finally looked at me. But I didn't want his pity. Pity doesn't pay the bills, and it doesn't buy back a life. I walked toward the well. I needed water to wash the grit from my face. When I got there, a man was already sitting on the edge of the stone. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, but he sat with a slight hunch, like a tree that had been struck by lightning once too often. He was wearing a dusty duster and a hat pulled low. He didn't look up. He was busy. He had a needle and a piece of coarse thread. He was stitching a jagged, bloody gash on his own forearm. No bandage, no medicine, just needle and thread. I stopped. The gow, the water bucket, slipped from my hand. It hit the ground, and a splash of water soaked right into the man's leather boots. He froze. Slowly, he looked up. His eyes were the color of river stones. Not cold exactly, just hard. He looked 30, maybe older. There were lines around his eyes that told a story of a lot of miles, and not many smiles. "Your bucket," he said. His voice was gravelly, deep. "It's ruining my boots." I "I'm sorry," I managed to say. "You're bleeding." "I'm aware," he snapped. He went back to his stitching. He didn't ask for help. He didn't even look at me again. "That's going to scar if you don't do it right," I said, stepping closer. "I've got plenty of scars," he grunted. "One more won't change the landscape." I watched his hands. They were thick and calloused, but they were trembling just a little. He was trying so hard to pretend he wasn't hurting that he was making it worse. "Hiding pain isn't the same thing as being strong," I said. It was a lesson my mother had taught me. Real strength is knowing when you need a hand. It's a basic human truth, even for a cowboy. He stopped stitching. He looked at me again. Really looked at me this time. "You're Abigail," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "I'm Arthur," he said. He bit off the thread with his teeth. "And I reckon we're getting married on Sunday." He stood up then. He was much taller than I realized. He didn't say another word. He just walked toward his horse, leaving me standing by the well with an empty bucket and a heart full of questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I looked at the water in the well. It was deep, dark. "All right," I whispered to the reflection. "But you won't disappear. Not this time." The night didn't bring much cool, just a change in the color of the heat. I sat on the porch. I didn't light a lamp. Lamps draw moths. And moths remind me of things that fly into the fire just because it's bright. I wasn't going to be a moth. I heard the horse before I saw the rider. A steady, heavy walk, not the hurried pace of a man looking for a fight, but not a lazy one either. Arthur Vance came out of the shadows like he was part of them. He dismounted. He moved slow. Like every bone in his body had a story to tell, and most of them were tragedies. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a man about to go to a funeral. "You're still up," he said. It wasn't a question. "Hard to sleep when your life is being traded like a head of cattle," I replied. I leaned back against the post. "What do you want, Arthur? Did your father send you to check the teeth of the bride?" He winced, just a small twitch near his jaw. He walked up the steps and sat on the top one. He kept a respectful distance, a whole world of distance. "I have $800 in my saddlebag," he said. He looked out at the dark horizon. "It's my money, not my father's. I earned it breaking colts and sweating through 3 summers. I can pay your father's debt. You can stay here. You can be free." I looked at him, truly looked at him. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. It gave just enough light to see the honesty in his face. It was a kind offer, a hero's offer. But life in Texas isn't a storybook. "And what happens when Harrison Vance finds out?" I asked. "He doesn't want the money, Arthur. He wants control. If you pay the debt, he'll just find another way to choke my father. He'll find another way to get this land. And then we'll both be looking for a place to sleep in the dirt." Arthur sighed. It was a long, tired sound. "I know. He's a man who feeds on the weakness of others." "Then we do it my way," I said. I reached into my apron pocket. I pulled out the piece of paper I'd spent the afternoon writing. "If I'm going to be a Vance, I'm going to be one on my own terms. Read it." He took the paper. He moved close to the faint light coming from the window. He read it slow. His lips moved slightly with the words. "You want a partnership," he whispered. "Not a marriage. Not in the way people talk about it." "I want my dignity," I said. I stood up and walked over to him. I wanted him to hear me clear. "This is a basic truth, Arthur. A human being is not a possession. I am not a prize you won or a debt you paid. If I walk onto your ranch, I walk as a peer. I walk as a person with the right to my own thoughts, my own work, and my own body." I paused. I let the silence sit between us. "Every person has the right to self-determination," I continued. I made sure my voice was steady. "That means I decide who I am. You don't get to shape me. You don't get to command me. We are 2 people sharing a roof to survive. That is the only way I can live with myself." Arthur looked up from the paper. He didn't look angry. He looked relieved. "Most men want a wife who stays quiet and does what she's told," Arthur said. He stood up. He was a head taller than me. "But those men are cowards. They're afraid of anyone they can't break. I don't want to break you, Abigail. A house built on a broken foundation won't stand a Texas wind. I accept your terms, not because I have to, because it's the only right way for two people to live." He reached out his hand. He didn't grab mine. He waited. I placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, warm. It felt like a promise. "One more thing," Arthur said. He reached into his duster pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope. "This is for you. A wedding gift. But don't open it until we're off this porch." The wedding was Sunday. It was a gray affair. The preacher looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My father looked like a man who had sold his soul and was waiting for the check to clear. Harrison Vance stood in the back, smiling like he'd just bought the sun. We didn't have flowers, we didn't have music, we just had the words. I do. It felt like a heavy stone being placed on a grave. When it was over, Arthur helped me into the wagon. We drove away from my father's house. I didn't look back. Looking back only gives you a stiff neck. We were 5 miles down the road when Arthur pulled the horses to a stop. The dust swirled around us. The heat was beginning to shimmer off the road. "Open it," he said. I opened the envelope. Inside was a piece of parchment. It was old. The edges were curled. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my mother's. It was her will. And there was the deed to the back 80 acres of our farm. The good land. The land with the spring. "My father said this was lost," I whispered. My throat felt tight. "He said she didn't leave anything." "He lied," Arthur said. His voice was hard. "My father helped him hide it. They wanted you to think you were penniless. They wanted you to think you had no choice but to be a victim." I looked at the deed. I looked at Arthur. "Why give it to me now?" I asked. "You could have kept it. You could have used it to control me." "Because a person's rights don't depend on whether they know about them or not," Arthur said. He looked me straight in the eye. "You have a legal and moral right to that land. It's your property. It's your independence. Giving it to you is just returning what was stolen. A marriage based on a lie is just a prison with better curtains. I want you to know you can leave right now if you want to. You have the land. You have the means." I looked at the deed. Then I looked at the long road ahead. "I'm staying," I said. "For now. Not because I have to, but because you're the first person in a long time who treated me like a human being instead of a bargaining chip." Arthur nodded. He snapped the reins. "Then let's get home, Abigail. There's a lot of work to do." The Vance Ranch was a big, lonely place. It sat in a valley that caught the wind and held on to the heat. The house was made of stone and heavy timber. It looked like it was built to withstand a siege. There were no flowers in the windows, no curtains, just wood and stone and the smell of old tobacco and leather. "It's not much for looks," Arthur said as he led me inside. "But it stays dry." "It's a house, Arthur," I said. I set my small trunk down in the hallway. "A house is just a shell. It's the people inside that make it a home. And right now, this shell feels pretty empty." He didn't argue. He showed me to my room. It was at the end of the hall. It was clean. It had a bed and a washstand. A window looked out toward the north. I could see the hills in the distance. "You'll have your privacy," he said. "I'll be in the other wing. If you need anything, Jed is usually in the kitchen. He's been here since before I was born. He's a good man, but he can't cook worth a lick." I waited until he left. Then I went to the kitchen. It was a disaster. There was grease on the walls. The stove was covered in ash. A man was sitting at the table, leaning over a bowl of something that looked like gray mud. He was old. His face was a map of every sun-drenched day he'd ever lived. "You must be the new boss," the man said. He had a toothless grin. I'm Jed. Hope you like beans because that's all we got. I looked at the pot on the stove. I looked at the filth in the corners. My mother always said that a dirty kitchen was a sign of a dirty mind. But I saw something else. I saw a house that had forgotten how to care for itself. I'm Abigail, I said. I rolled up my sleeves. And we aren't eating gray beans tonight, Jed. We're going to clean this room. Because every person deserves to eat in a place that respects their health. A clean environment isn't a luxury, Jed. It's a basic human requirement for a dignified life. Jed laughed. You talk fancy, girl, but talk don't scrub floors. No, I said, grabbing a bucket and a brush. Work scrubs floors. Now get me some hot water. By the time the sun started to set, the kitchen was unrecognizable. The wood was scrubbed, the stove was shining, and a pot of stew, made with the last of the salted beef, some dried onions, and a handful of wild herbs I'd found near the porch, was simmering. The smell was enough to bring a dead man back to life. The ranch hands started coming in around 6. There were 5 of them. They were dusty, tired. They smelled of sweat and horse. They stopped at the kitchen door. They stared. Who's the girl? One of them asked. He was younger than the others. He had a mean look in his eye. His name was Hank. I'd heard about him in town, a bully with a fast horse and a slow brain. That's Mrs. Vance, Jed said, proud as a peacock. And you'd best wash your hands before you sit at her table. Hank laughed. He walked over to the pot. He reached for a ladle. I don't take orders from a 19-year-old girl, especially one my boss bought with a bag of silver. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him. You'll put that ladle down, Mr. Hank, I said. My voice was quiet. And you'll go to the basin and wash. Not because I'm the boss's wife, but because we are sharing a meal as a community. And in a community, we show respect to the person who prepared the food and to the people we're eating with. Respect is the glue that keeps a group of people from turning into a pack of wolves. Hank sneered. He moved closer. And what if I don't? Then you'll go hungry, a voice said from the doorway. It was Arthur. He was leaning against the frame. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. She's right, Hank, Arthur said. He walked into the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Everyone at this table is a human being first. We aren't just workers. We aren't just tools for the ranch. We are people. And people treat each other with a certain level of decency. That starts with following the rules of the house. Hank looked at Arthur. Then he looked at me. He saw the fire in my eyes. He saw the iron in Arthur's. He turned around and walked to the wash basin. He scrubbed his hands, hard. The meal was quiet, but it wasn't a heavy quiet. It was the quiet of people who were actually tasting their food for the first time in years. After the men left, Arthur stayed behind. He helped me clear the plates. It was a small gesture. But in 1878, a man helping in the kitchen was a statement. You handled yourself well, Arthur said. I shouldn't have to handle myself, I replied. I dried a plate. People should just know how to treat each other. It shouldn't be a battle every time I want to be treated like an equal. The world changes slow, Abigail, Arthur said. He looked at the clean floor. But it changes faster when people like you refuse to back down. You taught them something tonight. You taught them that their work doesn't give them the right to be cruel. That's a lesson most of them never learned. It's a lesson everyone should know, I said. We all have the right to live without being bullied, no matter who we are or where we came from. Arthur looked at me. He reached out like he was going to touch my hair, but he pulled back. I think I'm going to like having you around, Abigail Miller, he said. Abigail Vance, I corrected him. No, he said, shaking his head. You were right the first time. You're Abigail Miller. You just happen to live here. He walked out then. I stood in the clean kitchen. The house felt a little less empty, just a little. I looked at my mother's deed on the table. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a prize. I was a woman with a plan, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was the one holding the reins. The dust never really settles in Texas. It just waits for the next pair of boots to kick it back into the air. I'd been at the Vance Ranch for 3 weeks. The rhythm of the place was starting to seep into my bones. I woke before the sun. I cleaned. I cooked. I watched Arthur from the kitchen window as he worked the horses. He was a different man when he was with the animals. His shoulders dropped. His face lost that look of a man expecting a punch. He spoke to them in whispers, soft words, words he didn't have for people. It was a Tuesday. The heat was already heavy by 9 in the morning. I was in the garden trying to coax some life out of the parched earth when I heard it. A scream. Not a shout of anger. A scream of pure, cold terror. It came from the woodpile near the big barn. I didn't think. I just ran. When I got there, the men were huddled in a circle. They looked like ghosts in the sunlight. In the center was Gideon. He was a young man, maybe 20. He was sitting on the ground, clutching his thigh. There was blood. So much blood. It was a deep, dark red soaking into the dirt. An axe lay nearby, its blade stained. "He slipped," Jed stammered. His face was white as a sheet. The wood was wet. He slipped. Arthur arrived a second later. He knelt down, but he didn't know what to do. None of them did. They were men of the frontier. They knew how to kill. They knew how to break things. But they didn't know how to fix a body. "Get back," I said. I pushed through them. "Abigail, stay back," Arthur said. His voice was tight. "This isn't for you." "Get back, Arthur," I repeated. I didn't yell. I just spoke with the authority of someone who knew exactly what was happening. "If you don't move, he's going to bleed out right here in the dust." I knelt in the dirt. I didn't care about my dress. I ripped a long strip of fabric from my apron. "Jed, get me the whiskey from the kitchen, and clean water, now." I looked at Gideon. He was fading. His eyes were rolling back. "Gideon, look at me," I said. I pressed my hands hard above the wound. "Look at me. You aren't going anywhere." Hank, the bully, stepped forward. "You don't know what you're doing, girl. You're just a woman. You'll make it worse." I didn't look up. I kept the pressure steady. "Listen to me, Hank," I said. My voice was like a knife. "Knowledge isn't a masculine trait. It's a human necessity. My mother spent her life learning the secrets of the body and the herbs of this earth. She taught me because she knew that on the frontier, the only thing between life and death is what you know. To deny a woman the right to learn is to deny this whole community a pair of hands that can save it. Ignorance is the only thing that's going to kill him today, not me." The men went silent. Even Arthur. Jed came back with the water and the whiskey. I poured the spirits over the wound. Gideon howled. I didn't flinch. I took a needle and some silk thread from the small kit I always carried in my pocket. "This is going to hurt," I whispered to him. "But you have a right to your life, Gideon. You have a right to see tomorrow, and I'm going to make sure you do." My hands were steady. I'd practiced on leather. I'd practiced on salt pork. I'd watched my mother stitch up a dozen men who'd been caught in the machinery of the world. I worked in a rhythm. In, out, pull. The blood began to slow. The wound closed. I wrapped it tight with the clean strips of cloth. I stood up. My knees were stained red. My hands were covered in Gideon's life. I looked at the men. They were staring at me like I'd just fallen from the sky. "He needs to be moved to the house," I said, "but quietly. Put him in the guest room. I'll need to watch him for fever." Arthur stood up. He looked at me for a long time. There was something new in his eyes. Not just respect. It was a kind of wonder. "You heard her," Arthur said to the men. "Move him. Gently." That evening, the ranch was quiet. The men ate their dinner without a word. They looked at me differently now. Not as a prize Arthur had brought home, but as a person of substance. I was sitting on the porch watching the stars. Arthur came out and sat on the steps. He handed me a cup of coffee. "You saved him," he said. "I did my job," I replied. "Every human being has a responsibility to help another when they have the skill to do so. It's a basic moral law, Arthur. It doesn't matter if you're wearing a dress or trousers." Arthur nodded. He looked out at the dark hills. I didn't want a doctor around here. I thought it brought bad luck. My mother died because a doctor couldn't get here in time. I blamed the medicine. I blamed the world for being so empty. It's not the medicine's fault, Arthur, I said. And it's not the world's fault. We have a right to health care. We have a right to be healed. But we have to build that world ourselves. It doesn't just happen. We have to value the knowledge of the mind as much as the strength of the arm. He stayed quiet for a moment. Then he spoke a name. The name I'd heard Jed whisper in the kitchen. Clara, he said. She was the one before you. She was beautiful, but she was terrified of this place. She looked at the dirt and saw a grave. My father told her she was a delicate flower. He told her she didn't need to know anything but how to smile. He stripped her of her agency, Abigail. He made her feel like she was nothing without his money. So she left with the man who had more of it. She wasn't a flower, Arthur, I said softly. She was a person. And if your father treated her like an ornament, he didn't respect her human dignity. No one can thrive in a place where they aren't allowed to grow. Arthur looked at me. I see that now. I saw you today. You weren't a flower. You were a storm. And you were the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. He stood up. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. The respect between us was a bridge. Get some sleep, Abigail, he said. You've earned it. I watched him walk away. I went into the house and checked on Gideon. He was sleeping. His breath was steady. I looked at the books I'd brought from my mother's house. I'd hidden them in the bottom of my trunk. Tomorrow, I'd bring them out. I'd put them on the shelf in the parlor. Because a person's mind deserves to be fed. And in this house, we weren't going to live in the dark anymore. The carriage arrived on a Friday. It wasn't a local wagon. It was a fancy, polished thing. Black lacquer and gold trim. It looked out of place in the Texas dust. It looked like a beetle that had lost its way. A man stepped out. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Arthur's whole herd. He had a gold watch chain and a silk hat. His name was Samuel Thatcher. I'd heard the name. He was a railroad man, a tycoon from the East. Harrison Vance was with him. My father-in-law had a smile on his face that made my skin crawl. It was the smile of a man who had just swallowed a canary. Arthur, Harrison called out. He didn't wait to be invited. He walked onto the porch like he still owned the place. I brought a guest, a very important guest. Arthur came out of the barn. He was wiping grease from his hands. He didn't look impressed. He looked like a man who smelled a skunk. Mr. Thatcher, Arthur said. He didn't offer his hand. What brings you to the middle of nowhere? Thatcher smiled. It was a cold, practiced thing. Progress, Mr. Vance. Progress is coming to Texas, and progress needs a path. We all sat on the porch. I brought out a tray of lemonade. I didn't stay inside. I stood by the door. I wanted to hear. I had a right to know what was being discussed in my own home. Thatcher laid out a map on the table. It showed a line, a straight black line cutting through the heart of the valley. It went right through Arthur's grazing land. It went right over the spring. The railroad is a miracle, Arthur, Harrison said. He was leaning forward, his eyes bright with greed. It will bring people. It will bring trade, and it will make us very, very rich. Mr. Thatcher is prepared to offer a significant sum for the right-of-way. Arthur looked at the map. He didn't look at the money. He looked at the line. That line goes through the water, Arthur said. His voice was low. It cuts the herd off from the creek. It ruins the grazing for 3 other ranches down the valley. Thatcher waved a hand. Collateral damage, Mr. Vance. Small prices to pay for the benefit of the nation. The railroad is the future. You can't stand in the way of the future. I stepped forward then. I couldn't stay quiet. The future doesn't have a right to destroy the present, I said. Thatcher looked at me. He raised an eyebrow. And who might this be? This is my wife, Arthur said. He stood up and moved closer to me. And she's right. "Mrs. Vance," Thatcher said, his voice dripping with false charm, "you must understand. This is about more than a few cows. This is about connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. This is about the growth of a great country." "Growth shouldn't come at the expense of the people who built this land," I said. I looked him in the eye. "Every person has a right to their property. Every person has a right to the stability of their labor. You come here with your gold and your maps, but you aren't looking at the families who live here. You aren't looking at the men who work this dirt. You're looking at a ledger, and a ledger isn't a life." Harrison scoffed. "Abigail, be quiet. This is business." "It's not just business, Father," Arthur said. He turned to Harrison. "It's about integrity. It's about standing up to a bully who thinks he can buy his way through people's lives. Mr. Thatcher, I won't sell." Thatcher's smile vanished. The mask slipped. "You're being foolish, Vance. I can go to the legislature. I can get an easement. I can take it for the public good." "Then do it," Arthur said. "But you'll have to explain to the public why you're destroying the livelihoods of a dozen families just to save a few miles of track. Every human being has a right to dignity in their work. My men work this land. They've poured their sweat into it. They have a right to a future that isn't sold out from under them for a quick profit. I won't be the man who signs away their dignity." Arthur looked at Thatcher. He looked like a mountain. "In a fair world, Thatcher, a man's home is his castle. Not because he's a king, but because he's a human being with a right to his own space. You don't have the right to push people around just because you have a fancy suit and a railroad behind you." Thatcher stood up. He brushed the dust from his sleeves. "You'll regret this, Arthur. The railroad is coming. You can either be on the train or under the tracks." "I'll take my chances on the ground," Arthur said. Harrison was livid. He looked like he was going to have a stroke. "You're throwing away a fortune, Arthur. You're ruining us." "No, Father," Arthur said. "I'm saving us. I'm saving the only thing that matters. Our name and our right to look our neighbors in the eye." Harrison and Thatcher left. The carriage kicked up a massive cloud of dust. It looked like a black smear against the sunset. Arthur sat back down. He looked tired. He looked older. "They'll be back," I said. "I know," he replied, but they won't find us sleeping." I sat down next to him. I took his hand. It was the first time I'd done that. His hand was rough. It was the hand of a man who worked for what he had. "You did the right thing, Arthur," I said. "Integrity over profit. It's a hard choice, but it's the only one that lets you sleep at night." "I learned it from you," he said. He looked at me. "I watched you with Gideon. You stood up for what was right because you knew the value of a person. I realized I couldn't let Thatcher treat my neighbors like they didn't matter. Everyone has a right to respect, Abigail, even if they don't have a railroad." "We'll fight them," I said. "We will," Arthur agreed. The wind picked up. It smelled of rain. A storm was coming from the west. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the storm. We were together. We were partners. And we knew what we were fighting for. We were fighting for the right to be seen, the right to be heard, and the right to keep the land that held the stories of our lives. As the first drops of rain hit the porch, I knew that the Vance Ranch wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was a place to stand. And we were standing tall. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered. It turned the Texas dust into a thick red soup that swallowed boots and bogged down wagons. But the rain brought the sickness, a damp, clinging chill that settled in the lungs of the families down the valley. I spent 3 days away from the ranch. I rode Arthur's best mare from cabin to cabin. I saw the Millers, not my kin, just a family with the same name and twice the bad luck. Their 3 girls were shivering under threadbare blankets. I boiled herbs. I made poultices. I didn't sleep. When I finally rode back into the Vance yard, the world was spinning. The house looked like it was tilting to the left. I remember Arthur's face. He looked blurry. He reached for the reins. He reached for me. Then the world went black. I woke up in my own bed. The room was warm, too warm. I could hear the crackle of a fire. My head felt like it was being squeezed by a blacksmith's vice. I tried to sit up. A hand, heavy and rough, pressed gently on my shoulder. "Stay down, Abigail," Arthur said. His voice was a low rumble. "You've got a fever that could melt lead." He was sitting in a chair by the bed. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He held a cup to my lips. It was ginger and honey, warm, sweet. "I have work to do," I whispered. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of dry hay. "Your work right now is to heal," Arthur said. He dipped a cloth into a basin of cool water and laid it across my forehead. "Listen to me. A person has a right to be cared for. It's not a favor. It's not a debt. It's a basic human right to have someone stand watch when you can't stand yourself. You've spent 3 days giving that right to everyone else. Now it's your turn to receive it." I looked at him, truly looked at him, the grumpy man, the man who supposedly had no heart. "I thought you said strength was everything out here," I managed to say. "I was wrong," Arthur said. He didn't look away. "Strength isn't just about how much weight you can carry. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable. Every human being has the right to be weak sometimes, to be tired, to be broken. If we don't allow ourselves that, we aren't humans. We're just machines made of meat and bone, and a machine doesn't know how to love." I closed my eyes. For the first time in my 19 years, I let someone else carry the weight. I slept for a day and a night. When the fever broke, the sun was shining through the north window. Arthur was gone. In his place stood Harrison Vance. He looked out of place in my sick room. He looked like a wolf in a counting house. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't offer a kind word. He just placed a stack of papers on the bedside table. "It's over, Abigail," he said. His voice was like a dry wind. "Arthur is a fool. He's going to lose this ranch to Thatcher and the railroad. He thinks integrity pays the taxes. It doesn't." I looked at the papers. Divorce. "Sign these," Harrison said. "I've included $200. It's enough for you to get to Wichita. You're young, you're smart. You don't need to go down with a sinking ship." "And if I refuse?" I asked. Harrison leaned in. His eyes were cold. "Then I call in the debt on your father's house. Every penny. I'll have him in the street by the end of the month. He's an old man, Abigail. He won't survive a winter without a roof." He stood up. He straightened his coat. "Arthur is incapable of loving you. He's a shell. Don't waste your life trying to fill a hole that has no bottom. Think about your father. That's your duty." He walked out. He left the room smelling of expensive tobacco and cheap threats. I sat there holding the papers. My hands were shaking. Not from the fever, from the truth. Harrison was right about one thing. I had a duty to my father, but he was wrong about everything else. He thought he could buy my choice. He thought he could use my love for my father as a chain. "Coercion is not law," I whispered to the empty room. "A choice made under a threat is not a choice at all. It's a crime against a person's soul." I looked at the door. I could hear Arthur in the hallway. I could hear his heavy boots. I could hear the way he moved, slow, steady, and sure. I tucked the papers under my pillow. I wasn't going to let Harrison win. Not yet. But I felt a coldness in my chest that the fire couldn't touch. I had to decide, my father's life or my own heart. And for the first time, I didn't know which one was worth more. The moon was a sharp silver hook in the sky. It watched me as I packed my small trunk. I moved in silence. I didn't light a lamp. I knew the rhythm of the floorboards. I knew which ones groaned and which ones held their peace. I was going to leave. I'd spent the evening thinking. I'd thought until my head ached. If I stayed, Harrison would ruin my father. He'd take the house. He'd take the land. He'd leave an old man with nothing but his regrets. I couldn't live with that. I left a note on the kitchen table. "I'm sorry." 2 words that didn't say nearly enough. I carried my trunk out to the porch. The air was crisp. It smelled of sage and damp earth. I started toward the stables. "The stage doesn't run until 6 in the morning," a voice said. I jumped. Arthur was sitting in the shadows of the porch. He was leaning back in his chair. He had a rifle across his lap, but he wasn't holding it like a weapon. He was just there. "I have to go, Arthur," I said. My voice was thick. "Is it the money?" he asked. "Or is it the fear?" "It's my father," I said. I dropped the trunk. It hit the wood with a dull thud. "Harrison, he told me. He'll take everything from my father if I don't sign those papers. I can't let him do that. I have a responsibility." Arthur stood up. He walked toward me. He didn't stop until he was a foot away. I could see the moonlight reflecting in his gray eyes. "Listen to me, Abigail," he said. "Responsibility is a good thing. But you cannot be responsible for the sins of other men. Your father made his choices. Harrison is making his. You have a right to your own life. That is a fundamental truth. No one has the right to use your heart as a bargaining chip." "But he's my father," I cried. "And you are his daughter, not his property," Arthur replied. "A person's right to self-determination is sacred. It's the very core of what it means to be alive. If you leave now because of a threat, you aren't being a good daughter. You're just becoming another piece of furniture in Harrison's house. You're letting him decide who you are." I looked away. I looked at the dark stables. "He said you can't love me," I whispered. "He said you're a shell. He said I'm wasting my time." Arthur stayed quiet for a long time. The only sound was the wind in the grass. "He's right about the past," Arthur finally said. "I was a shell. I'd spent 8 years building a wall so high that no one could see over it. I thought that was how I stayed safe. But safe isn't the same as living." He reached out. He didn't take my hand. He just let his fingers brush against my sleeve. "Every person has the right to be known," Arthur said. His voice was rough. "To be seen for exactly who they are, the good, the bad, and the broken. I've spent my life hiding because I didn't believe I deserved that right. But then you came here. You didn't ask for permission to see me, you just looked. And you didn't turn away." "I couldn't turn away, Arthur," I said. "Then don't turn away now," he said. "Stay. Not because you're a Vance, not because of a contract. Stay because you choose to. If Harrison tries to take your father's house, we'll fight him together. We'll use that deed you have. We'll use the law. But don't let him steal your choice. That's the only thing he can't take unless you give it to him." I looked at my trunk. I looked at the man standing in front of me. "You're asking me to be brave," I said. "I'm asking you to be free," Arthur replied. "Freedom isn't just about where you go. It's about why you stay." I didn't pick up the trunk. I turned around and went back into the house. The next morning, I didn't go to the stagecoach. I went to the town of Caldwell. I went straight to Harrison Vance's office in the bank. I didn't wait to be announced. I walked in and slammed the divorce papers on his desk. They were torn in half. "I'm not signing," I said. Harrison looked up. He looked surprised. Then he looked angry. "I told you what would happen, Abigail. I'll have your father out by noon." "No, you won't," I said. I pulled out the deed Arthur had given me, the one my mother had left. "This land is mine. It's 80 acres of the best grazing in the county. It's worth more than the $800 my father owes you. I'm offering you a trade. My land for his debt, clear and simple." Harrison laughed. "That land is worth 3 times the debt." "I know it is," I said. "And that's the price of your silence. You'll leave my father alone. You'll leave Arthur alone. You'll take the land, and you'll walk away." "And if I don't?" "Then I go to the circuit judge," I said. "I'll tell him about the hidden will. I'll tell him how you and my father conspired to hide a legal document from a minor. That's fraud, Harrison. And the law, as imperfect as it is, still recognizes the right to an inheritance." I leaned over the desk. I looked him right in his greedy eyes. "Every person has a right to justice," I said. "Even a 19-year-old girl. You think because you have money you own the truth. But the truth is a stubborn thing. It doesn't care about your bank account." Harrison stared at me. He saw the fire. He saw that I wasn't a girl anymore. I was a woman who knew her worth. "Fine," he spat. He pulled out a ledger. "I'll take the 80 acres. Consider the debt paid." "I want it in writing," I said, "now." He wrote it. He signed it. He stamped it. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I ever had. I'd lost my land. I'd lost my inheritance, but I'd gained my soul. I rode back to the ranch. Arthur was waiting by the gate. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked at my face. "You did it," he said. "I did," I replied. "I made a choice, my own choice." "How does it feel?" he asked. "It feels like I can finally breathe," I said. Arthur opened the gate. "Then come home, Abigail. There's work to be done. But today we work for ourselves." As we walked toward the house, I realized that the dark wasn't so scary anymore. Because when you know who you are, the dawn is always just a heartbeat away. The dust from my encounter with Harrison Vance hadn't even settled on my boots before Arthur found me. I was standing by the corral. I was watching the sunset. It was a fierce, bloody orange, the kind of sky that makes you feel small and infinite all at once. Arthur didn't ask how it went in town. He didn't have to. He saw the way I held my head. He saw the way my shoulders had finally dropped their guard. "You took your stand," he said. He was leaning against the fence rail. "I did," I said. "I traded my land for my father's peace. It's a steep price, Arthur. But a person's peace of mind is worth more than any number of acres. We can't truly own the earth if our souls are in debt to fear." Arthur nodded. He looked at me for a long heartbeat. Then he stood up straight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. It was old. It was rusted at the edges. "Follow me," he said. He didn't lead me to the barn. He didn't lead me to the stables. He walked back into the house. He went to the far end of the western wing. There was a door there. A heavy oak door I'd noticed a dozen times. It had always been locked. I'd assumed it was a storage room for old tack or broken furniture. Arthur fit the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clack. He pushed the door open. He stepped aside to let me pass. I stopped. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. The room was bathed in the dying light of the sun. It flooded in through a large new window that faced the east. The walls weren't bare stone. They were lined with shelves, solid hand-carved shelves of dark walnut. And those shelves were full. Books, hundreds of them, leather-bound and sturdy. I saw titles I'd only ever heard of in whispers. Gray's Anatomy, The London Dispensatory, Principles of Surgery. There were jars, too. Clear glass jars filled with dried herbs, lavender, willow bark, foxglove, and things I didn't even recognize. There was a desk, a wide, smooth desk with a high-backed chair, and a set of fine steel surgical tools that caught the light like stars. "What is this?" I whispered. My voice felt like it was coming from a mile away. "This is yours," Arthur said. I walked to the desk. In the center, sitting on a piece of fresh parchment, was a document. It had a gold seal. It was an enrollment for the St. Louis School of Nursing and Midwifery. The fees were paid. The dates were set for the following year. I touched the paper. My fingers were trembling. I was entirely speechless. The words I'd used to fight Harrison Vance were gone. I felt like a vessel that had been emptied and then filled with light. "I started collecting these 3 years ago," Arthur said. He stayed by the door. He didn't crowd me. "I heard stories about a girl in Caldwell, a shadow healer. People said she had hands that could pull the fever out of a child. They said she knew things the town doctor had forgotten." "You knew?" I turned to him. "You knew it was me?" "I didn't know for sure," Arthur said, "but I hoped. I suggested you to my father for the marriage because I wanted to see if the stories were true. I didn't want a wife to wash my shirts, Abigail. I wanted to see that healer given a place to work." He stepped into the room. He touched the spine of one of the books. "Listen to me," Arthur said. His voice was steady. Every soul has the right to develop their God-given talents to their fullest extent. It is a fundamental right to have one's skills recognized and nurtured, not buried under the chores of a household. To deny someone their calling is to rob the world of a miracle. I looked at the tools. I looked at the certificate. "You're giving me a career," I said. "No," Arthur corrected. "I'm giving you the tools to claim what you already are. Society tells a woman she must be one thing or another, a wife or a worker, a mother or a scholar. But that's a lie designed to keep half the world in the dark. A person has the right to professional recognition. You have the right to be called a doctor or a nurse or whatever name you choose for the skill you carry." I looked at him, truly looked at him. He had built this for a stranger. He had built this for the idea of me. "Why?" I asked. "Because a person's value isn't found in their service to others," Arthur said. "It's found in the brilliance of their own mind. I didn't want to save you, Abigail. I wanted to witness you. There is a great dignity in being seen for your true purpose, and I wanted to be the man who held the door open for you." I couldn't speak. I just walked to him. I put my head against his chest. I heard his heart. It was a strong, steady rhythm. "I'm speechless, Arthur," I whispered. "Good," he said softly. "Sometimes the best truths don't need words. They just need a place to grow." The next morning felt different. The air was still hot. The dust was still there. But the house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a beginning. I spent the morning in my new room. I touched the jars. I smelled the dried peppermint. I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't have to hide who I was. I didn't have to read my mother's journals by the light of a dying candle. I walked out to the porch. Arthur was there. He was working on a piece of leather, a new bridle. "Arthur," I said. He looked up. "I want to change the contract," I said. He set the leather down. He looked wary, like a man waiting for a storm. "What changes?" "I want to tear it up," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the paper we'd signed on my father's porch. The business marriage. I held it out. "This was based on a lack of trust," I said. "It was based on the idea that we had to protect ourselves from each other. But we aren't those people anymore. A contract is for strangers. Partners don't need a map to know where they stand." "Abigail," Arthur began. "No, listen," I said. I sat down on the steps next to him. "Every human being has the right to change their mind. We have the right to evolve. If we stay stuck in the agreements of our past, we never reach the potential of our future. I'm choosing to stay here, not because I have to, but because I want to." Arthur took the paper. He looked at it. Then he slowly tore it into 4 pieces. He watched the wind take them. "I suppose that means we need to talk about the garden," he said. "The garden?" "You've been working that patch of dirt for weeks," he said. "It needs a name. Everything I care about on this ranch has a name. The horses, the cattle, the men who work the line. If it has a name, it has a place in my heart." I thought about the flowers I'd been trying to grow. The roses, my mother's favorite. "Rose garden," I said, "because she never had a place where she was allowed to bloom." Arthur nodded. "Rose garden it is." He turned to me. He took my hand. It was the first time he'd done it without a reason, without a wound to stitch or a horse to lead. "I have to tell you something, Abigail," he said. "Something I've been practicing in my head." "Tell me." "Love isn't what they say in the books," Arthur said. His voice was husky. "It's not a fever. It's not a trap. True love is the freedom for someone to grow into their best self. It is a liberation, not a possession. If I love you, it means I am committed to your liberty as much as my own." I felt the tears prickling at my eyes. Not sad tears, the kind that come when a heavy door finally swings open. "You aren't a grumpy cowboy, Arthur Vance," I said. "I am," he grunted, though his eyes were smiling. "I'm cobby and I'm stubborn and I'm set in my ways. But I've learned that a person doesn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. Every human being has an inherent worth that doesn't change based on their mood or their mistakes. I looked out at the valley. I saw the cattle. I saw the distant hills. "We have a lot to do," I said. "The railroad will be back. Harrison will be watching." "Let them come," Arthur said. "A house built on mutual respect and shared truth is a harder thing to break than stone. We are two independent people who have chosen to walk the same path. That is the strongest bond there is." He stood up. He pulled me up with him. "I have a confession," he said. "Another one?" "I don't just like having you around," he whispered. "I need you, not to cook, not to clean. I need you because you're the only person who ever looked at me and saw the man I wanted to be instead of the man I was." "That's because that man was always there, Arthur," I said. "He just needed someone to call him by his right name." We stood on that porch for a long time. The heat didn't matter. The dust didn't matter. We were Abigail and Arthur. We were healers and protectors. We were partners in the truest sense of the word. As I looked at the western wing, I knew that my mother's books were finally home. And so was I. "I'm going to go read," I said, smiling at him. "Go," he said, tipping his hat. "I'll be here when you're done. I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I said. And for the first time, Sunday didn't feel like a deadline. It felt like a promise. The air in October was different. The heat had finally broken its back. The Texas wind was cooler now. It carried the scent of dry grass and the promise of a long, quiet winter. It had been 6 months since that gray Sunday in April. 6 months since I walked into this house as a stranger in a debt. We weren't holding a second wedding. We didn't need a preacher to tell us what we already knew. But Arthur wanted a gathering. He wanted the people of the valley to see us, not as a transaction, but as a union. Jed had spent 3 days roasting a pig. The ranch hands, Gideon, Hank, and the others, had scrubbed the barn until the wood shone. Even the horses seemed to know something was changing. There was a peace on the Vance ranch that hadn't been there for a decade. I stood in my medical room, the library Arthur had built for me. I looked at the certificate on the desk. My name was there, Abigail Jane Miller, my maiden name. Arthur had insisted on it for the enrollment. He said I should enter that school as the woman I was born to be, not the woman I was traded to be. "Every person has a right to their own name," Arthur had told me that morning. "A name is a legacy. It is a verbal declaration of who you are in this world. You shouldn't have to bury your identity just to share a life with me. That is a basic truth of human respect. We are two whole people, not two halves trying to make one." I walked out to the porch. The guests were starting to arrive. Small wagons, dusty riders, people I'd healed over the last few months. They brought pies and bread and hand-knitted blankets. They didn't look at me with pity anymore. They looked at me with gratitude. Then I saw a wagon I recognized. It was battered. The mule was old. My father, Thomas Miller, sat on the bench. He looked smaller, older, like a man who had finally realized the weight of the things he'd carried. He climbed down slow. He walked up to the porch. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked at me. "Abigail," he said. His voice was a thin rasp. "Father," I replied. I didn't move toward him, but I didn't turn away. "I didn't think you'd want me here," he said. He was wringing his hat in his hands. "I invited you, Father," I said, "because every person has a right to a second chance. It is a fundamental human value to allow for growth and for the seeking of forgiveness. We aren't defined by the worst thing we've ever done, provided we have the courage to acknowledge it and change. I want you to see the woman I've become, not the girl you sold." Thomas looked around the ranch. He saw the medical wing. He saw the way the men tipped their hats to me. "I failed you," he whispered. "I thought I was saving the land. I forgot that land is just dirt. A daughter is a soul. I treated you like a commodity, and for that I will be sorry until they put me in the ground. A father's duty isn't to control his child's life, but to be the bridge that helps them cross into their own. I burned that bridge." "Then we'll build a new one," I said. "It won't be the same. But it will be honest, and honesty is the only foundation worth building on. Arthur stepped out then. He didn't loom over my father, he stood beside me. He offered his hand to Thomas. "Welcome, Thomas," Arthur said. "Today we're celebrating a partnership. I'd be honored if you stayed." My father took his hand. He nodded. He walked toward the barn, his head held a little higher. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills when Arthur and I stood before our neighbors. We didn't have a pulpit. We just had the dirt beneath our boots and the truth between us. Arthur spoke first. He didn't have a script, he just looked at the men he employed and the neighbors he'd ignored for years. "I've lived a long time in the dark," Arthur said. His voice carried in the cool air. "I thought strength was a wall. I thought independence meant being alone. I was wrong. I've learned that a man's true strength is measured by his capacity for empathy and his willingness to treat others as his equal. I stand here today not as Abigail's owner, nor as her master. I stand as her peer." He turned to me. "I vow to respect your mind as much as your heart," he continued. "I vow to protect your right to your own ambitions. Every human being has a right to pursue their calling without apology. I will not be the man who stands in your way. I will be the man who stands at your back." It was my turn. I looked at the women in the crowd, the tired mothers, the young girls with wide eyes. "I didn't choose this marriage at the start," I said. "I was forced by a debt I didn't create. But I am staying because I choose to. Every woman has an inherent right to her own agency, to her own choices, to her own body and her own future. I have found a man who recognizes those rights as sacred. We are here today to declare that a home should be a place of mutual liberation, not a place of quiet servitude. Tying your life to another person should be an act of freedom, not a surrender." Hank and Gideon started to clap. Then Jed. Then everyone. It was a loud, joyous sound. It felt like the valley was finally waking up. In the middle of the noise, a black carriage pulled up at the edge of the yard. It didn't stay long. Harrison Vance sat inside. He didn't get out. He just watched. He saw the crowd. He saw the respect. He saw that he no longer had a seat at this table. Arthur walked to the edge of the yard. He looked at his father. Harrison didn't speak. He just signaled the driver to move on. Arthur came back to me. "Is he gone?" I asked. "He's gone," Arthur said. "He realized that you can't buy what we have. He spent his life thinking people are just chess pieces, but chess pieces don't have souls, and they don't have the power to forgive. I told him once that he needed to decide who he wanted to be with the time he had left. I think he's decided to be a ghost." "We aren't ghosts, Arthur," I said. "No," he said, pulling me close. "We're the realest thing in this county." 2 years later, 1880. The Texas sun was warm on my back as I knelt in the rose garden. It was June. The roses were in full bloom, red, white, and a pale, dusty pink. They smelled of home. I had finished my first year of training in St. Louis and returned for the summer. The ranch was different now. We had a proper clinic. People traveled from as far as San Antonio to visit the healer of Caldwell. Arthur was coming across the yard. He was carrying a small bundle in his arms, our son. He was 4 months old. We named him Harold Arthur Vance. Harold, for the man my father was trying to be. Arthur, for the man who had given me the world. Arthur sat on the bench I'd built near the roses. He looked down at the baby. He wasn't a grumpy cowboy anymore. He was a man who knew the value of a soft touch. "He looks like you," Arthur said. "He has your chin," I laughed. I stood up and wiped the dirt from my hands. I sat next to them. "I was thinking about the first day I came here," I said. "The well, the bucket, the way you told me I was ruining your boots." Arthur grinned. "I was a miserable cuss." "You were a man who had forgotten that he mattered," I said. "And I was a girl who thought she had to prove her worth every single day. We've come a long way, Arthur." "We have," he said. He looked at me, his eyes full of that quiet, steady light. I was thinking about something you told Gideon once, about how knowledge isn't a masculine trait. I want little Harold to grow up knowing that. I want him to know that respect isn't something you give because someone is stronger than you. It's something you give because they are a human being, with a right to their own journey. He'll know, I said. He'll see it every day. I leaned my head on Arthur's shoulder. The baby gurgled. The wind moved through the roses. Later that evening, after the baby was asleep, I went into my library. I opened my mother's journal. It was full now. My own notes, my own discoveries, my own life were written on the pages that used to be blank. I picked up my pen and wrote the final entry. June 1880. The garden is thriving. The clinic is full. My son is healthy. I realized today that the greatest gift Arthur ever gave me wasn't the books or the tools. It was the space to be silent until I found my own voice. True love is not a cage. It is not a trade. It is the recognition of another person's soul as equal to your own. I was forced to marry a stranger, but I chose to love a partner. And in that choice, I found my freedom. I closed the book. I blew out the lamp. I walked down the hallway toward the room we shared. I didn't walk in shadows. I walked in the light of the moon, sure of my steps, sure of my name, and sure of the man waiting for me on the other side of the door. The Texas dust would always be there. The heat would always return. But as long as we stood as equals, the storms could never wash away what we had planted. This channel tells emotional stories about Western cowboys, frontier romance, motherly love, compassion, human dignity, and kindness between people. If this story gave you something to think about, please support the channel by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing for more meaningful Western stories. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
This story leaves us with a truth as wide and enduring as the western sky. No human soul was ever meant to be owned, traded, silenced, or reduced to a debt. Abigail's journey begins in fear, under the shadow of men who believe money and power can decide the worth of a woman. But step by step, she proves that dignity cannot be signed away on paper, and freedom cannot be stolen from a heart brave enough to claim it. She teaches us that a person's value does not come from obedience, beauty, marriage, labor, or usefulness to others. It comes from simply being human, from having a mind, a voice, a dream, and the right to choose one's own road. Arthur's journey is just as powerful. At first, he appears to be a hard and silent cowboy, a man shaped by loss, bitterness, and loneliness. But through Abigail's courage and compassion, we see that even the roughest soul can still be healed when it is met with respect instead of judgment. Arthur does not save Abigail by controlling her. He helps her rise by giving her room to become who she already was. And in return, Abigail teaches him that strength is not a wall around the heart. True strength is the courage to be gentle, to admit pain, to stand beside another person as an equal, and to love without turning love into possession. The heart of this story is not only romance, it is about partnership, human dignity, forgiveness, and the quiet power of compassion. It reminds us that a home is not built from timber, stone, or land alone. A true home is built from trust, mutual respect, and the freedom for each person inside it to grow. Abigail and Arthur show us that love should never be a cage. Love should be a place where a person can finally breathe, finally speak, and finally become whole. This tale also reminds us that kindness can change more than one life. Abigail's healing hands do not only save bodies, they soften hearts, restore hope, and bring warmth back to a place that had forgotten it. Her courage inspires the ranch hands, challenges injustice, and even opens the door to forgiveness with her father. The story tells us that every act of mercy, every stand for what is right, and every refusal to treat people as less than human can plant something strong enough to survive the storms. So when we leave Abigail and Arthur beneath the Texas moon, we carry with us a lesson worth remembering. Never let fear, debt, tradition, or another person's judgment decide who you are. Your voice matters. Your dreams matter. Your wounds do not make you unworthy of love, and the right kind of love will never ask you to disappear. It will help you stand taller in your own name. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will stay with this channel, where we share emotional stories of Western cowboys, frontier love, motherly devotion, compassion, forgiveness, and the deep kindness that can still bloom in the harshest places. Please leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, send this story to someone who may need its message, and subscribe to join us for more meaningful tales from the Western frontier.